Welcome to Todd Talk. Today we're going to talk about superlatives.
Todd Talk is brought to you by Mr. Soft's Hot Sauce. It's the spiciest.
Superlatives. The best, the worst, the funniest. One of my members suggested I do a Todd Talk on superlatives, where I would tell you about some of my best, worst, funniest. By the way, if you want to be a member, you can click join down below. It's as little as 99 cents. Really helps out the channel and you get a bunch of fun stuff. But anyway, I've got 6 of them for you. So the first one I'm going to talk about is, what's the biggest snake I've ever seen? I've seen some big snakes on TV. I've seen some big snakes in the zoo, but I'm talking about the biggest snake that I've ever run into personally. Through most of my adult life, I've been a pretty active hiker, and I've gone to some different places out in the woods, in the wilderness, and that sort of thing. And I live kind of in the Willamette Valley, so it's very green, very forested, not a lot of snakes. But when you get on the other side of the Cascade Range, it becomes much more of a high desert situation, and there's a lot of snakes out there. I've been on a few hikes where they have signs at the beginning of the path or at the beginning of the trail that says rattlesnake warning, be mindful, etc. But I'd never, ever run into one. Never saw one, never heard one. Until one day in the summer, I was out in Bend, Oregon, and I was doing a hike around Smith Rock. And as I was walking along, pretty narrow trail with bushes and high grass and rocks and things on the side, just out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I'm pretty good at spotting things. I have kind of a critter vision. It's a little bit of a superpower. If there is a bird or if there is a rodent or if there is a snake, I'll spot it. And so there's just this flash of movement down by this rock. And I kind of stand there for a minute looking, and I carefully edge my way around towards the back of the rock, and I can see a snake moving along the back of the rock. I can only see about this much of it because of the way things are kind of arranged. There's just this little pile of rocks and there's just this snake body kind of moving through there. And as it gets to the end, I see a rattle. So I was kind of like, ooh, hooray, I got to see a rattlesnake. That was pretty much that. I kind of waited for a minute to see if anything was going to change, and I backed up a little bit, and then I made my way on down the trail. And before I took the next corner, I just happened to look back and I saw the snake crossing the trail. So I ran back up the trail and I got pretty close to it. I was probably about 5 feet away from it. Got some pictures. It didn't coil up or rattle or anything like that. It was pretty calm and it just sort of made its way back into the bushes, and that was that. I'd say from nose to tail, it was about 3 feet long, or about a meter. So compared to some of the little garter snakes that we get out here in the Pacific Northwest, it was a pretty big snake. What's the coldest I've ever been? There's 2 stories that come to mind when I think about being cold. One time I was in Chicago. I'd gone out there for work, and it was during one of the polar vortexes. An amazing amount of cold air had come down from the north, and the temperatures were barely above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. I brought the hat and the coat and the scarf and the gloves and all of that. But there was one night where some coworkers and I went out to get food, and it was so cold that even with all of this bundled up stuff, like the wind would just cut through you, and you could feel yourself just like shivering uncontrollably under all of these layers. And we were just laughing because we were like literally dying. We weren't in any real danger. We were in civilization. We were just running a couple of blocks from one building to another, but it was definitely one of the times that I was coldest. The other time I was super cold, I was working on this film project with some friends. We were doing these little YouTube episodes about a wildlife expert who would give advice. And it was really bad advice with, some charming humor. It was pretty funny. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check it out. Without spoiling anything too much, at the end of the last episode, we wanted to film a scene in the snow. We'd filmed a scene in the summertime where I was dressed in a certain outfit, and we decided we wanted to kind of mirror that, but in the snow. So we all piled in and got our gear, and we drove up to Mount Hood, and just outside of Timberline Lodge, we did some filming. and I was wearing exactly the same outfit that I was wearing in the summertime. So we did a couple of shots, and one shot, I'm just kind of sitting in the snow, leaning up against a tree, eating a snow cone. And I was so cold. I was absolutely not dressed for the elements, sitting in ice, eating ice, and it was absolutely painful and miserable. I don't recommend it. What's the scariest heights I've ever encountered? Heights are definitely the one thing I am afraid of. I have a real hard time with high up places. And it's not necessarily elevation. You know, I have been inside of skyscrapers, I've been in an airplane, but it's edges and ledges that really kind of set off my ick. You know, like railings where it's multiple stories, or observation decks, or like if you're walking over a bridge and it just has handrails, that's just really uncomfortable for me. One time, I wasn't really in any danger. It was just a very high place that made me feel really icky, was the observation deck of the Willis Tower, or the Sears Tower in Chicago. On the 103rd floor, it's basically an observation level, so there's windows on all four sides. And they have these glass boxes that kind of poke out, so you can walk on a glass floor and just kind of be over the street. One thing I like to do when I am traveling is I like to take pictures of my feet. It's just a weird thing I do, but I've gotten some really great pictures in some really unusual locations, and I was absolutely determined to get a picture of my feet in this place. And there's other people who are just kind of walking out there, or they're sitting on the glass and they're posing for pictures. It took everything in my core being to get both feet out there on the glass. It was one of the hardest things. It just feels so wrong and so counterintuitive to step out on a piece of glass 103 stories up in the air. But I did it. So now there have been other times where I've been hiking or backpacking, and there's some trails that are a little bit precarious. Just recently I was camping on the Oregon coast, and there is a hike called Cape Lookout. This cape kind of pokes out into the Pacific Ocean a couple of miles, and you can hike out to the end of it. Now this thing is big enough and tall enough that in World War II, during fog, a plane crashed into it. There's a plaque out there memorializing that. So it's a big, big piece of rock out there. And there's a couple of places where you are just basically walking on the edge of it. And it's about 300 feet down to the ocean. Most of the time it's just kind of trucking along, but every once in a while it'll just sort of open up and you just get that, oh gosh, I better not slip or trip or anything, or else I'm in a lot of trouble. There's another hike that's in the Columbia River Gorge called Eagle Creek. I've done this hike as a day hike, and I've also done it with a backpack and stayed the night out in the forest. And you basically hike along this canyon that Eagle Creek runs through, and the elevation changes quite a lot. And there are some places that are so high and so sheer that they've actually screwed cables into the rock face so that you have something to hold on to. Once you get about 5 or 6 miles out, there's a really magnificent waterfall called Tunnel Falls, where they actually dynamited the trail out of a rock face and then dynamited behind the waterfall. So there's actually a little tunnel to walk through. It's really unusual and really cool. And then just beyond that, maybe a half mile or so, is another waterfall they call Twister Falls, because these two waterfalls kind of come off together. And it's a couple 100 feet up in the air. And again, really precarious. Just these little trails along this cliff face with a wire to hold on to. So those are probably the scariest heights that I've ever had to deal with. What's the weirdest breakfast I ever ate? I tend to be really traditional with my breakfast. Some days I'm a eggs and bacon and toast kind of guy. Some days I'm an oatmeal kind of guy. But that's about it. I don't really go into omelet land or anything else, unusual or interesting. Except for one time, I went to Las Vegas, and I decided while I was there each morning, I would go out for an unusual breakfast. One morning, I went to a restaurant called The Henry, and I had their short rib Benedict. Absolutely delicious, really, really rich, Highly recommend. The Henry is still there and they still serve it. The next morning I got up and I went to the Hard Rock Hotel and I had Captain Crunch French toast. I think what they did is they crumbled up Captain Crunch and then they made French toast and then coated it in the Captain Crunch cereal and then cooked it. So it was really crunchy, really sweet, really unusual, and very delicious. That hotel is not in Vegas anymore, but you can find the recipe online if you want to make it. What is my worst travel story? I really like traveling, and I'm quite a planner. I usually book things and buy tickets way in advance. I make reservations. I look up transit routes and things like that. So I feel generally pretty prepared. And I don't mind spending money on cool things, and I don't mind waiting in lines to see neat stuff. There's really only 2 times I had a little bit of a bummer with travel. The year 2000, my family went to Walt Disney World. Now, I flew out late one night, and I was meant to go from Portland to Dallas, and from Dallas to Orlando, and then I would meet up with everybody else there. So I flew out, and when I got to Dallas, there were storms or something, and all the flights were canceled. So I ran over to the gate, got rebooked on a flight from Dallas to Fort Lauderdale. Fort Lauderdale's not a really big airport, wasn't a lot to do there, and I had a layover of 8 hours. And when you look on a map and you see how close Fort Lauderdale, Orlando are, I feel like I could have almost walked during 8 hours of time. But yeah, just kind of sat there, absolute sheer boredom, knowing that I could be in Disney World, but I wasn't quite there yet. Eventually flew out. It was like a 20-minute flight, and then I was there. The other travel story, I drove out to Boise, Idaho from Portland, Oregon. Just had never been before. I had some friends out there, and so I thought I'll drive out, spend a couple days, check it out, and then come back. And when I drove out, I went along the Columbia River Gorge, which is very pretty and picturesque, and then kind of dipped down into Boise. Stayed there for a little bit, and then I decided when I drove back, I would drive from Boise to Bend, Oregon, kind of through the plains and the desert, and then come around that way. Now, the morning I got up, gas tank was a little bit low, and I thought, I don't want to pay all the taxes in Idaho. There's no tax in Oregon. I'll just wait until I get across the border, and then I'll buy gas. Between Boise and Bend, there is nothing. There's absolutely nothing. You're just on this 2-lane road, and there's no cell reception. There's nothing. After driving a bit, I got to a point where the gas gauge says E. So I'm starting to think like, okay, when the gas runs out, is there somewhere for me to pull off? Because some places there's really not. And then I was like, okay, and how far am I going to have to walk? Pretty soon the needle is dipping just below E. And I'm doing the math in my head, and I'm like, okay, it's about 20 miles to Bend. And if I walk this fast, it would take me this long to get there. And then maybe I could find a way back out here with a gas can. There are not many times in my life where I've just been that kind of white knuckle freaked out, not sure how things were going to go. And then out of the middle of nowhere, a little gift shop, a single gas pump in front of it. I don't recommend it. What is the most impressive art I've ever seen? That one time I was in Chicago for work in the very, very cold times, I went into their museum, and it was the first time I'd really seen very famous art. They have a tremendous collection of stuff, and there's a lot of them that people would recognize. It's the museum that they went to in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, so there were some pictures and areas that were recognizable from that movie. From that point on, whenever I'd go to a big city, I would make a point to check out some of their art museums. Besides just getting to see cool stuff, it's also pretty inspiring to see different types of art. There's certain pieces of art that just really kind of resonate with me, or that have a story that I find really intriguing. There's a Monet painting that I saw in Denver, and there happened to be a museum employee who saw me looking at this piece of art, and we had a bit of a conversation, and I learned a lot about why the painting exists. And it was really, really neat to understand what the artist was going through and how this happened. You know, it's cool to understand that this thing was created by a famous artist or it's very old. But the other thing that's neat to remember is that this bit of canvas and this paint was in a different location that looked like that painting. Has sort of like almost like a time travel feel to it. But as far as the most impressive piece of art that I've ever seen, probably in Washington, D.C., there is a painting there by Leonardo da Vinci. And it is impossible to explain or to capture in photos. I took this picture just so I could kind of remember, but when you are there, standing in front of it, it looked like a living thing. It's really hard to explain. Just the quality of light and paint, it was unlike anything that I had seen. It was enchanting and uncanny. You know, people say what a great artist he is, and you of course know about the Mona Lisa and things like that. Seeing it in person was just unbelievable, and I just stared at it for the longest time because it was so unusual and so just incredibly crafted. If you got some free time, go to the museum. It's cool, cool stuff. And those are 6 superlatives for you. You know, if you like this kind of thing, leave me a comment. If you have more questions or want to know more superlatives, leave them in the comments and maybe I'll do another one of these.